Hi, everyone, and welcome to the teaser interviews with the Hemingway Review. Today, I'm joined by Ryan Hediger, who is a professor of English at Kent State University and author of Homesickness of Trauma and what is it? The Search for a Place. Can you help me out with the last part?
Of trauma, the desire for place in a changing environment. Yeah.
Thank you. I had it in front of me and then it disappeared. And also we'll start by saying that Ryan has an article in this edition or this issue of the Hemingway Review on the Snows of Kilimanjaro as an allegory for the Anthropocene. And unfortunately, because it's been a crazy semester, we're doing the teaser interview after the book or the issue has arrived. But hopefully you'll still enjoy our time together and our interview today. So Ryan, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for inviting me, Suzanne. This is fun. It's great to get to talk about this.
Oh, good. Yeah, well, it's such an important topic. So I thought we'd kick it off with the idea of the Anthropocene. I'm pretty sure most of our viewers know what it is, but just in case they don't, can you tell us what it is and why it's a term we're hearing more and more about lately?
Yeah, so the term has different meanings, but in a nutshell, it means the age of humans. And the term kind of derives from debates in geology about how to date the beginning of a new epoch, a new geological epoch, to signal the changes that humans have made on the planet. And there's a long-running debate about which signal to pay attention to, whether it's the presence of nuclear fallout, whether it's the presence of carbon in the atmosphere. There's all these possible signatures that would mark the beginning of the Anthropocene. So that's one part of the debate. And I mean, we could talk about the Anthropocene for this whole time, because there's a really heated debate too about whether the name is at all warranted, given that, according to critics of the Anthropocene concept, a lot of the changes that underlie it are spurred by very specific kinds of civilizational developments. Capitalism, one group wants to call it the Capitalocene to emphasize how capitalist production is part of this, and others want to call it different names. The Anglocene is another term. There's a whole discussion about this, but the basic idea is that it tries to name a new relationship between humans and environment that began either in 1950 or in 1784 or somewhere in there.
Okay, great. And is the reason why people explore different names is because I'm assuming it's that humans don't have to have this particularly exploitive relationship to the earth.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So thank you for saying that, because I think that is one of the strongest impetuses behind the critique, is that is this basic idea that Anthropocene means age of humans, and the critique is, well, not all humans did this. So, we need a different name to signal a different kind of responsibility.
Great, thank you. Also, you talk a little bit at the start of the essay about the role of environmental humanities in helping us think through the complexities of the Anthropocene. And we'll use that term for convenience. But, that's a really interesting point for me, because a lot of times when we start to talk about environmental impact, we think about science and scientists, or even political scientists, before we think about the humanities. So what is the role of environmental humanities in helping us think through this moment?
Yeah, I agree that this is just a crucial and fascinating question for the reasons that you just enumerated. I mean, this idea that science is the real source of knowledge is a widely prevalent idea on lots of questions, of course, but especially on environment, right? It's science that's going to deliver solutions, and then maybe political science that will help us negotiate those scientifically discovered solutions to climate crisis. But really, since the dawn of eco-criticism as a contemporary movement it kind of began in literary studies, but through philosophy and humanities more generally, one of the strongest defenses of environmental approaches, or you could just say one of the strongest defenses of the environmental humanities, has been that the humanities focus on questions of value, whereas, for example, the sciences tend to focus on questions of fact. And you need both sets of inquiries. And that's for me a really robust, important point, because as science scholars, science studies scholars point out, I mean, the sciences are actually driven partly by questions of value. The kinds of questions they ask, the kinds of inquiries they pursue are motivated by questions of value. So they need to think about those too. And of course, environmental humanists need to think about and learn about the sciences too. So I think we environmental humanities people should continue to sort of defend our approaches to these kinds of questions, and to point out that the work that we do in universities, for example, remains really crucial.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much. Great. Well, now let's turn to the essay itself. In the essay, you write that the Anthropocene provides a new and powerful frame for reading Hemingway and other authors. So how do you see the Anthropocene doing that?
I think the Anthropocene framework helps us bring more to the foreground a lot of the elements that are often in the background. Questions of environment, questions of climate, questions of all these material entities that humans rely on and that are implicit in all forms of expression. So it changes the way we read any kind of text, I think, that framework, and especially because the Anthropocene reaches across wider spans of time. It also encourages us to read text differently, and to make meaning differently.
Okay, great. Maybe a way of thinking about this would be to talk about the essay and what you're trying to accomplish in the essay itself. In the essay, you read Snows of Kilimanjaro as an allegory of the Anthropocene through Harry and his sort of deathbed reckonings. So how does that work? How is that structured for you?
Yeah, I mean, I had two things in mind with the allegory approach. One is, it just struck me teaching this story recently, a few years ago, before the conference in Paris, how much of what Harry was going through resonates with contemporary environmental questions, and especially questions around selfhood. So the allegorical part of it is connected to that, just that Harry is a little bit allegorical for so much of what's happening. But then as I thought more about the concept of allegory, there's also the element of allegory that loosens subjectivity a little bit, the self, and the self becomes this kind of category. And so I start thinking about Harry as representative in that sense. And in that way, reading allegorically, I think, chimes with a lot of things that that philosophers and others are saying about selfhood these days, that sort of throw selfhood into a little bit of doubt, at least traditional selfhood in traditional humanist frames. So I get into that just a little bit in the essay too.
Right. So how are some of his experiences, or some of the things that he contemplates, how are they connected to our concerns around the impact of humans on the planet?
Yeah. I mean, it's, for one thing, I mean, it seems like the story and the story represents so much of what Hemingway is doing again and again in his work, where it's the sort of human in nature, or more specifically, really, because these are gendered, man in nature, and what happens there. And this attempt to sort of get back to a kind of primal or original, or maybe even innocent relationship between humans and environment, which, I mean, I just think that's an abiding theme through all of Hemingway's work. And here we have him, in Africa, pursuing this kind of primal hunting pursuit. And it seems to me that he's trying to get at fundamental questions about how humans relate to the non-human environment and non-human animals. So in that sense, the story's main questions are the same questions that a lot of people are exploring in the Anthropocene, like how should humans relate to the world? What ways should we change? How could we do this differently? Those kinds of things. I mean, for me, that's the big picture.
Great. And that makes me think about Hemingway's relationship to Africa, sort of more generally or more broadly, something that, I'm interested in, and I know you are interested in. we talk a lot about the kind of colonial imperialist framework for Hemingway's interactions with these spaces. You know, the big game hunting, the very splashy safaris, the instrumental view of natives and animals, at least in some of the writing. But there's also, as you were, I think, just referencing, a desire for a non-extractive view of relationship to Africa in Hemingway's work. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how both of those elements are available to us in Hemingway, and maybe why he seems to be struggling with both of those elements.
Yeah, oh, that's such an interesting question, isn't it? Like the why part of this, because I mean, you know, reading some of your work on this question too, on his sort of writerly identity and how he's anxious about it, to put it lightly. I mean, that's of course another big theme in Hemingway studies, is kind of his anxious relationship to the writing act, especially as he gets older. But I think this text is so interesting, like Snows of Kilimanjaro, because it thematizes that kind of paradox.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the context of the story, on the one hand, like by my reading, he's constantly reducing his whole life to these little vignettes, and they're vignettes that are like impossible vignettes. So it's like it's this weird, like he's disappearing into his stories, into these really short stories. On the other hand, of course, like by doing that, he's reproducing this whole logic of selfhood that some people would say is extractive, right? Like he goes to Africa, you know, comes up with some stories, ends up in magazines, produces books that sell all over, you know, the English speaking world, and reproduces a kind of imperialist relationship, arguably. So like, but to me, part of what's interesting about that is the internal contradictions of it, and the sense that the author of the story is in turmoil about it.
Mm-hmm. In turmoil. Well, first of all, also kind of an object, insofar as he sees himself as a victim of his wife's money, but also, you know, in the moment where you write so beautifully about the moment where he incurs the injury that winds up killing him. And so, you know, that's a moment where, maybe could you talk a little bit about that moment where he's trying to take a photograph of the water bucks, and he winds up with a life-ending injury.
It is, I mean, such a brilliant piece of plotting, I think, and so smart. Like, I mean, obviously the context is, you know, this arguably imperialist trip to Africa, and, you know, it's a big macho hunting trip. And here we have the macho hunter very sensitively paying attention to animals by way of not a gun, but photography, right? So, and then, you know, again, so smartly, like he doesn't even get the picture that he wants. But so the story can kind of capture the narrative around the absent picture, the non-existent picture, and it, you know, and how he then gets the scratch. And like that whole episode is such a concise rendering of human vulnerability, which to me also, you know, it is allegorical of the Anthropocene too, where the Anthropocene is precisely human vulnerability produced by human power.
Right. Wow.
It's so weird, right? Like all of our technological know-how, and it goes over the top and produces a new kind of vulnerability, which is exactly in a way what happens in the story.
Yeah. We all have to pick up dialect of the Enlightenment again, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Feels like.
Exactly.
Also in the essay, you talk about the need in our current day to move beyond just colonial imperialist frames that persist when we talk about Euro-America and its relationship to the global South. So you admit that moving past that framework is fraught with both risks and advantages. So I wanted to invite you to outline a few of those for us.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me one of the biggest risks is the long history of appropriation and the long history of uneven power relationships. So, you know, you have Europe going to Africa, Europe coming to the Americas, and encounters end up reproducing an uneven power structure. And that's a really familiar point. The hazard there is that those critiques, which we need to have, can end up making people too cautious about encountering other cultures, about learning from other cultures, about a kind of cultural fluidity that is a fact of life too. So I think both of those things have to be borne in mind. Like learning from other cultures, being interested in other cultures is crucial, I think, to moving forward and trying to figure out new ways of being in the world. And to me, that's a big part of what Snows of Kilimanjaro does, right? And even Hemingway in Africa more generally, his fascination with this radically different set of cultural practices. But, how do we do that without folding those kinds of encounters back into appropriation, back into uneven power relationships?
It's the $20,000 or $20 million question, isn't it?
Oh, it so is. And, it comes up in so many fields.
Mhm.
Whether you're thinking about gender or, indigenous studies, or just it comes up again and again.
Yeah, contact is always a charged moment, fraught moment. So,
Yeah.
okay, so also in the piece, you challenge Frank Mering's reading of Harry as self-centered, and that's surprising, of course, because he is very, very self-centered in the story, and sometimes even to the point of being cruel to other people, specifically his wife. But you see a greater value or purpose in Harry's self-centeredness. So can you tell us, what that is and how that works?
Yeah. And I think, in a way, I might have written that differently if I thought about it more, because clearly, Harry is self-centered to a fault, for sure. And in fact, it seems to me one of the dynamics of the story is him working around to finally admitting that in language in the story. But the flip side of that is the kind of, well, I think part of what I am saying in the article is that his self-centeredness doesn't mean that he's not interested in Africa. So, and I think Harry is very self-conscious of the self as a kind of prism for perceiving the world.
Mhm.
So he's always going to perceive the world through his selfhood. But the story also has him, I think, in all these interesting ways, trying to recalibrate what it means to be a self. And there's it's another one of those paradoxical movements in the story where on the one hand, he's really self-centered and self-obsessed. On the other hand, that very movement is encouraging him to sort of almost dissolve the self or destroy the self. It's a kind of self-destructive impulse
Mhm.
in the story that again resonates with lots of Hemingway themes.
Mhm.
But yeah, so for me that's a big part of this is that that paradoxical movement where he digs deeper into himself, but doing that takes him right back out of himself. It takes him into his anecdotes, which are all stories of other places. And it takes him out of, he's kind of destroying his relationship as he's doing a lot of this. So all these markers that are traditional forms of meaning of the self, of the subject, he's blowing up, he's ruining, or changing. Yeah.
Yeah, and is that connected then to your idea that the story is a critique of the Anthropocene then?
Yeah, it is. I think the Anthropocene calls on us to rethink what it means to be a self. And I think a part of this, and there's kind of a long tradition of this in environmental humanities thinking that goes back at least to Emerson in the American tradition of thinking about the self as much more porous and in dialogue with environments construed very broadly, like any places in environment in this formula. So the way that environments produce us as well as we produce environments, and that kind of porosity, the porousness, that I think is something that the humanities should do more to come to terms with in the Anthropocene, because there's all sorts of implications for it. But one of them is that putting the environment into a dangerous situation means putting culture into a dangerous situation because we're not insulated from it.
Great. And it's also, I think, connected to a certain idea of humility as well, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Absolutely. Like a kind of sanity saving humility, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Just putting humans back into the spectrum of their animal register, or the part of them that's animal, as well as the part of them that, quote unquote, has dominion over all. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Absolutely. And yeah.
So another question I had, and this will be the last formal question about the essay, but it's much bigger than the essay as well, is that you see Hemingway as really finding a way to critique the instrumental view we sometimes have of other people and of environments. You see this as part of a tradition in Hemingway's writing, sort of spurred, I think you say, by his experience in World War I, where he is really questioning throughout his entire career what it means to live, how to live, what the proper relationship to others in the environment is. So would you like to talk a little bit about how those ideas come together for you in this story and in Hemingway's work in general?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems to me part of this is about the long running theme of Hemingway asking questions about what it means to be a writer. On the one hand, being a professional writer, a writer who writes for money. So his being obsessed with success in that way, and on the other hand, his kind of resenting what he's had to surrender or what sacrifices he's had to make as a person, to be that professional writer. And I think that's thematized in this story, in some ways, partly with the sort of the plot, the kind of, or not plot maybe, but the kind of acknowledgement that in some ways he's deeply dependent upon his wife, Harry's wife, in the story. So there's a weird way in which Harry has to pursue his career. He has to surrender big parts of himself, and for me, that's emblematic of a bigger historical question about the place of labor. And this is an area I've been doing a lot of thinking and writing on recently, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit more. But I see that in Hemingway constantly, a kind of constant anxiety about the basic social contract around work, around labor, around the place of labor in our lives, versus, say, other kinds of pursuits, hunting, fishing, more kind of traditionally recreational pursuits.
Yeah, but his alchemy was trying to turn those recreational and aesthetic pursuits into his labor, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Great. True.
So
but he's still, he still kind of constantly resents his identity. He resents his identity as a professional writer in certain ways. It's a recurrent theme.
Yeah, that's true.
Even as he loves it, it's another paradox. But
yeah, well, nobody said working with Hemingway was boring or simple. Yeah, constantly trying to find ways to say two things at once, right?
Yeah.
So you alluded to some of the work that you're doing now and some of the thinking you're doing now on labor. But so what is next for you? What are you working on right now?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that. It's because some of this thinking I've been doing it shows up in this essay indirectly, but I'm just putting the final touches on an essay collection I edited and contribute to a little bit, called Planet Work. And the subtitle is Rethinking Labor and Leisure in the Anthropocene. So it fits this discussion well. And the basic argument of the collection is that the core norms around labor over the last, say, 500 years are organized around extraction of resources, extraction of labor, extraction of wealth, and that kind of norm guides a lot of our cultural thinking, our moral systems. I mean, you think about like how sacrosanct the notion of work is in our culture. I mean, I think across the political spectrum, for example, hard work is mostly respected and considered at the core of kind of moral being. But it's precisely that work ethic, I think, that is at the core of what people are calling the Anthropocene. All these trends that are culminating in the Anthropocene. So it's what we're doing in this essay collection is look. First of all, we have a set of essays that kind of investigate work norms in these terms, and then the second half of the book has essays that explore leisure and the values and norms around leisure practices as alternative possible norms that we might want to accent more going forward in the Anthropocene, so that instead of extraction, we'd have a different set of values that were more organized around, say, care, to use the term from feminism that we privilege in the text. So instead of care instead of extraction.
Interesting. So when you think about leisure activities in that text, can you give us a few examples? Because immediately my mind's running, thinking most of the leisure activities I can think of are extractive.
Yeah, absolutely. Key point. Yeah, and I don't think I think one of the traps of this framework that we set up is like, yay, leisure, and that solves it. And it clearly does not. I mean, especially modern leisure practices. Yeah, they're extractive. They're I mean, if you want to put it this way, they're ecologically expensive often. But a big part of leisure values are about, instead of transforming the world in order to be more productive, they're about enjoying the world. To put it simply, like, I mean, again, we're talking big picture, so I'm simplifying, but so some of the practices that people write about, some of the contributors write about in the piece, involve things like walking. So there's a great chapter on Dorothy Wordsworth and her walking practices in the context of male labor norms. So you've got a female presence whose relationship to the world is organized differently, partly because her relationship to labor is different. There's a parallel chapter that toward the end of the book that investigates Darug walking. That's a First People in Australia, and so the contributor Joe Ray talks about what kind of relationship is constituted by a long-standing practice of walking through country, and the kind of relationship that produces. So it's walking through a field of perception and an environmental field versus extraction from that field.
Wonderful, thanks. And when can we expect the volume out?
It's going to be late 2022, maybe early 2023, I think.
Okay, great. Well, we wish you best of luck with that.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Ryan, for being here with us today.
Thanks for these great questions, Suzanne. This has been really a great discussion, and I've learned from it. So thank you.
Lots of fun for me too. Thank you.